All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here. This is the second half of chapter 4. So I will just get going. Hopefully you have all your stuff in front of you and you are ready to go. Okay, so chapter 4, the first half we discussed slavery and the establishment of it as an institution in North America, all right? And that was just the whole half of it. And then we were talking about growing resistance and some rebellions that were taking place, okay? And we ended with the Stono Rebellion, right? Okay. Like I said, the chapter switches tones, but, okay, so let us just see how our European colonists were fighting for their personal freedom and liberty, which is the opposite of what our first half of this chapter was about. But let's see how, while enslaving an entire population of people, same persons involved are fighting for their own freedom. So, British patriotism is where we shall start. All right. Okie dokie. So for most of the 18th century, Britain battled with France, which we've talked about, and think about all of our religious conflicts, Protestant versus Catholic. Okay, so that makes sense going back and forth. And at that point, France kind of replaced Spain as a main rival for Britain. As a result of this, Britain begins focusing on building their military up, which was done through taxation. Okay, so taxes begin being implemented in more ways, which is something we'll definitely get into over our next chapter. But so taxation becomes a point of revenue for the Brits. And so as a way to manage that, there was the creation of the Bank of England, all right? This also, with this revenue that's being created and the military and this national bank, it creates this real sense of national identity, okay? And with this identity will come the ideologies of republicanism and liberalism. All right, so republicanism celebrated the participation in public life. It was considered to be an essence of liberty. This is why we vote today, all right? Public participation, it's our civic duty to do so. And this was, everything came down to the greater good, okay? You do these things for the greater good, for the betterment of society, all right? And in addition to republicanism is liberalism. And this is the idea that liberty was individual and private for Europeans, okay? They believe that they retained natural rights, which at this point in time, it's life, liberty, and property. So whenever we get to the revolution, we'll talk about those some more, but life, liberty, property, all right? There was also, and going back to this idea that, you know, your liberty is your private business, this also referred to privacy and family affairs, religion, and economic activity, so spending. So this will later lead to others, specifically the impoverished and then poor, women and slaves. This would encourage different groups to challenge limitations on their own freedom, especially when it comes to voting, as we get down the line. Which unfortunately for our class we won't really get into, but that comes about with really beginning with the 14th Amendment. Anyway, so liberalism establishes itself now for European property holding, well, if you're property holding, you're most likely male, so mostly European men at this time, and eventually inspires other groups to adopt ideologies like this also. Okay, moving right along. Okay, so these next few slides are called the public sphere because during this time, and I won't really get into a lot because it's so deeply interconnected with every bit of our society. But there's the development of the public sphere and the private sphere, and division of labor based on gender. So the private sphere is the home, and that will become this is where women work. The public sphere is out in the world, that becomes the workforce, that is where men are supposed to work. Okay, so just as a general concept, whenever I say public sphere or private sphere means home. Private sphere means home, public sphere means out in society, okay? But so in regards to the public sphere, voting is a big part of that. So suffrage, okay? Suffrage varied between colonies, mostly centered around property qualifications, which I kind of hit on already, but property is a big focal point at this point in history, all right? So it ensured that men who possessed an economic stake in the community developed policies, which we'll get into that over the next couple of slides, so don't worry about that too much right now. But based on these property qualifications, more individuals were able to vote already in the early colonies than were able to vote in Britain. So this was considered a step up. And of those who could vote, it was really about between 50 and 80% of adult free Euro-American men in the colonies, as compared to 5% in Britain. Okay, so significantly more people were able to partake in this public sphere, all right? So some areas barred particular religions, which you could look at, you could go colony to colony and kind of see what's the dominant religion there, what are their perceptions of other groups. So thinking about Roger Williams, who went on to found Rhode Island, and basically his whole goal was to be tolerant of all religions, okay? That wasn't necessarily the case for others, where, Protestantism is the one and only. Anyway, but so, different areas bar different religions. And in areas like Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, African Americans who had property at this point in time began having those rights taken away, okay? So this will happen throughout the 18th century, the 1700s. And across the North, for the most part, African Americans and First Americans were generally prohibited in voting, being legally recognized as people, all that stuff. So, our public sphere, just for our European population for right now, okay? Okay, in New England, town officers were elected, and elsewhere, they were appointed either by the governor or officials in London. So the issues that we have today with a lot of different laws varying state to state, this all goes back to the colonies. Local, smaller issues and debates were kept at that level. So there's a lot of differentiation depending on where you are, okay? But so these are just kind of generalized statements that I'm making. So some town officials were elected, some were appointed by the governors, some were appointed by people back in England. So it just depends, okay? Again, property qualifications. Like I said, this is a big thing for our colonists. So of course you would have to own property to be able to hold an office, hold stake in your society. Okay, that property qualification in South Carolina was 500 acres and 10 slaves, or town property that was worth £1,000, $1,000, which meant the only way you could be an office holder is if you were wealthy, incredibly wealthy. That's a lot of personal wealth to have. 500 acres, that's huge, okay? Not to mention 10 slaves. Anyway, so this creates this we've already talked about these class divisions that are happening and establishing themselves. So this just exacerbates and encourages that division even more, okay? So yeah, like I said, nearly all legislators were planters or wealthy merchants, because that's what the law dictated. Okay, so there was a tradition among citizens that wealth, education, and social prominence carried a right to hold public office. So going back to what I just said about South Carolina, yes. It was believed that if you were wealthy, then you had this right to hold public office, all right? Like I said, there's a wealthy class division that pursues. That is our gentry class, right? Our gentry is our wealthy, leisurely class, all right? Also, those running for office often freely distributed food and liquor, so handing out bribes, at the courthouse on election day. This was actually whenever Thomas Jefferson was first elected in Virginia. He handed out rum in front of the courthouse that day. So, did that have any influence? We'll never know. But anyway, so that was very common, especially, you know, if you're that wealthy that you have hundreds of acres and multiple slaves and thousands of pounds worth of wealth, then yeah, you can afford to hand out those bribes. Okay. Alrighty. Also, offices were passed down in families, so not that much. The pattern that's beginning here is mimicking what was happening back in Europe that people were fighting against, right? All right, so the first half of the 1700s, Britain adopted a policy of salutary neglect, and that meant that the colonies were largely left to self-govern, so to elect their own officials, to have their own elections, all right? They're mostly just left to their own accord, all right? So these local assemblies, the assemblies in the colonies, became more assertive over time as they kind of, you know, got more experience, so just over time. And local leaders began to insist that the assemblies had the same rights and powers in local affairs that the House of Commons had back in Britain. So this is kind of the first bit of challenge that we see from the colonies going back to Britain, all right? There are issues of currency that begin to arise, which we'll see more, not just in this moment alone, but this comes back to those resources. Go back to silver and gold, all right? That was, everybody wanted it for, you know, the last 200 years, so from the 1400s going until this point in time, so about 250 years, we'll say. And gold and silver, those resources are being depleted, okay? So there's a scarcity of it. And the colonies each colony began printing their own money, in which it was then considered worthless by officials in London. This will become problematic over time, all right? But so colonies start trying to make their own money. It is denied by the powers that be back in England. Also, issues over land policies and levels of rent that were being charged to the colonists on land that was owned by the crown or those proprietors, those first company owners that came over. Those first people who come over create, you know, that first wealthy class and then just kind of grow from there. But, so there are issues over what amount of power should those in England still have now that the colonies have kind of come into their own, all right? Okay. All right, let's talk about the printing press. So this will be an innovation that really helps spread these ideals that we're talking about. Okay. Neither the Spanish, who were in Florida and New Mexico at this time, or the French, who were in New France, which is Canada, nobody had a printing press, all right? There was one Well, the missionaries had established one in Mexico City in the 1530s. So by printing press, this just means an operation of using interchangeable letters to print books and publications much quicker and for lower costs. Okay, so that's what I mean by printing press. Okay, in British North America, so in our colonies up north, the first press was established by Benjamin Franklin. It was called the Library Company of Philadelphia, and it was started in 1731. Okay. So by the American Revolution in the 1770s, 75% of free adult men and 33% of women could read and write. This all has to do with the implementation of the printing press and getting books into people's homes. And the majority of families would own at least one book, which would be your family Bible, all right? And we start to see libraries come about. So circulating libraries begin to appear in cities and towns, different communities across our colonies as a way for people to trade books because, you know, yes, the printing press makes them more accessible, but they're still relatively expensive at this time. So, you know, that's why if you're going to get one book, you're going to get your family Bible. And then if you can go out and get other literature from your local library. Okay. The first continuously printed newspaper came about in 1704, which was the Boston Newsletter. There are 13 newspapers in the colonies by 1740. There are 25 by 1765. And mostly they were small weekly publications that just kind of stuck to communities, all right? Be like your weekly gazette, if you will, all right? Okay, and by the 1730s, political commentary was now becoming pretty widespread as a result of the printing press and people having accessibility to reading material, okay? Which will lead us into conversations about what is freedom and what does that involve, okay? So freedom of expression comes about as a direct result of the printing press and who can say what and what is allowed to be printed, okay? So freedom of speech, this concept, developed in England in the 16th century, but it wasn't for, you know, all of us, just for average citizens. It was for lawmakers and legislators to be able to speak freely while they were in session, all right? So it wasn't just this general concept for all of us. Let's see, there was no legal protection over expression for average people, like I said, and you could be executed depending on what you said and who you said it about or who you said it to. Okay, so at this point in time, it was still considered very dangerous to openly dissent, all right? Freedom of press is part of that, like I said. Okay, in 1695, there is a British law passed that required the licensing of, this law ended. We talked about this. Okay, so the law that stated anything that was being distributed to the colonies had to have a stamp of approval. Okay, that ends in 1695. That's where we're at. Okay. So yeah, anything that had been sent out prior to this, so all of our newspapers, books, pamphlets, they had to be approved, and it would have a little seal that said it was approved by the British Crown. And then whenever that ends, people are like, woo! And just start sharing their wealth of knowledge and ideologies with one another, okay? Okay, so 1695. So after that, so authors and publishers could still be, you know, sued and prosecuted after 1695, especially if they're talking about public officials. Yeah, publishers were often brought in and forced to apologize for some of the things that they would publish. Okay, so newspapers adamantly defended the freedom of press. That's the whole basis of their existence, right? As the right of the citizenry to monitor and criticize the government and public officials. Okay. Few attacked unless they were financially backed to do so. There we go. So people were often bribed to come out and speak out against these publishers and people. Okay, moving along. American Enlightenment. So in the book it goes more into English Enlightenment and then, or the European Enlightenment, and then shifts over to American Enlightenment, which is what I am mostly just going to focus on. Okay, but let us think back to Salem and after the witch trials, the bringing in of the scientific revolution. Okay, so Enlightenment is part of that. All right, really comes out of France, then to Britain, then to the colonies. But so this stated, or the basis of all of this is that the scientific method, based on research and experiment, applied to political and social life. And reason, not religious enthusiasm, should be the basis of these elements of life, all right? Which religious enthusiasm was what the Salem witch trials were all about. All right, Benjamin Franklin exemplified Enlightenment in British North America. He was probably the best known American of the century. Like I said, this came about from the scientific revolution that was ushered in by Sir Isaac Newton and others. But anyway, okay. Imperial rivalries. All right, so we've been talking about what is going on kind of in the colonies. So this takes us back out to our worldview a little bit more. Okay, here I have a note. It says map page 128. I imagine that is from the 5th edition, and I accidentally brought the wrong volume of the book with me. So either way, whatever edition you have, if you can thumb through and find this map pretty quickly, European empires in North America, circa 1750. This kind of shows you what was going on over here pretty much on the eve of the American Revolution. We're still, like 20 years away, but we're getting pretty close in the grand scheme of things. So please check out that map. Okay, and then let's talk about the 7 Years' War for a moment. Okay, this is also known as the French and Indian War. From the British side of things, since they were fighting with the French and Indigenous Americans who were allied together. Okay, and this is the first of the century's imperial wars of the 18th century. And this came about whenever Virginia gave 500,000 acres to the Ohio Company. Okay, so I think Ohio is a little further inland, further west. So our colonists are starting to move in, okay? So this area, which if you have that map in front of you, should show exactly what I'm talking about. Show you Ohio, and you can see this next point I'm about to make. But, so this land, this 500,000 acres, is given to the Ohio Company. That parcel of land is then pushing on French land, what's in today Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania. And so this puts the French and British frontiers like butting up against one another, and everybody gets upset, okay? So the French had Iroquois support. The British had their own support from different communities. And so this goes on for 9 years, okay? So 1754 to 1763. And actually, I won't get into it too much, but if you guys are interested, if anybody's doing research that relates to this in any way, if you want this as a resource, it's out there. But the Smithsonian published an article probably 2 years ago, and nobody has ever known the actual moment that the 7 Years' War began. And historians kind of finally concluded that based on these different diaries that they found from soldiers and people who were in the vicinity, that the first person who fired a shot, therefore starting the war, was a young commanding officer named George Washington. So, anyway, I have thought that's fascinating ever since I read that. So, that's out there if you guys want to dive on in. But anyway. Okay. Where am I at? Okay. So the 7 Years' War, it permanently altered the global power balance. Remember, Britain has been kind of at the lower end of the scale of things. And the issues that are happening in North America will also carry over to different colonies run by different European powers, okay? Well, first of all, it spreads to Europe. It spreads to West Africa. It also spreads to Asia, all right? And going back to the beginning of this, we said that the Brits were raising taxes, their military was increasing, okay? This is going hand in hand. And so, as a result of really just these 9 years that I'm talking, or these 7 years. Oh, 7 Years' War. Anyway, technically 9 years' war. But anyway, I digress. This makes the British a global power, okay? It strengthened any pride that was felt nationally. And then this will really... I will say abuse of power comes as no surprise. I've probably said it already. I'll probably say it again. But once the Brits become this global power, they begin, abusing that power to certain extents. And we will see that with different taxes that are being placed on our colonists and all of that. But this is really whenever Britain becomes... top dog, if you will, okay? Alrighty. So in keeping with our 7 Years' War, first Americans identified along lines of kinship, language, and geography in those alliances that I was kind of talking about. Okay, so like European colonists and enslaved Africans, first Americans did not have formed ideas about being a unified nation, which is something that we've talked about before. And violence directed at first Americans during the 7 Years' War led to really the first allegiance of nationhood, which creates a, quote, pan-Indian identity. So looking back, I'd said there's been the misconception that, which I mean, as generations go on, we've debunked this, but there was a big misconception that, there was this unified identity of first Americans whenever the Spanish arrived. So that misconception comes out of this pan-Indian identity concept, okay? Okay. That identity was rejected by many, and it led to a lot of debates. Okay. Alrighty, so let's see. The French back off and go back north. And so the departure of this French power, or of the French, eliminated the balance of power. Like I said, the British become more in control. So the French cede their land to British control. there's more dependency on the British crown. Oof. And British culture from First Americans. There's also a lot of confusion about alliances. The French just leave, and our indigenous communities that had these alliances with them are like, well, now what do we do? We're kind of alone, and here are all of these other groups that have allied with the British that still have that connection. So this confusion ensues. But anyway, okay, so let's see. There is also, in 1763, there's a revolt in the Ohio Valley, so still keeping in that same area. There's a revolt by First Americans, also in the Great Lakes, so just up north. This was a revolt against British rule. This became known as Pontiac's Rebellion, and it was inspired by the teachings of someone named Neolin, and it rejected European technology, any dependence on alcohol, encouraged people to clothe themselves in ancestral clothing as a way to drive out the British. And then this also combined ideas with the pan-Indian identity concept, really as a way to just form an alliance and strengthen your numbers. That makes sense. Okay, so sorry, so parched. Okay, we're in the summer of 1763 now. Okay, so we're talking about the Ottawa, the Hurons. So think Canada. Ottawa is a province. Lake Huron. Okay, so north central. These two communities and others besieged Detroit, which was a fort. And if you still have that map pulled up, it should, for the forts that were destroyed, should be noted on there. I think so, yeah. But so Fort Detroit burned. During that campaign, they went on to seize 9 forts total, which should be on your map, and killed hundreds. There's then a British retaliation. So there's a lot of animosity, and they were slow to make peace and resolve this, all right? But the way they do make peace is the British issued, what was the Proclamation of 1763, and this prohibited further colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. So like I said, people are starting to move inland and go west. So yeah, it was supposed to prohibit further settlement. Settlers hated that idea. So they are enraged. They ignore it. They continue to move further west. Okay, and then that just increases any tension that was going on between First Americans and settlers, because they were supposed to have come to this agreement, and British settlers were not, or European settlers were not keeping up their end of the deal. They ignored what was settled upon and were continuing to move in further west. And so, yeah, this just creates more and more tension. Okay? Okay. And that is where chapter 4 leaves off. And chapter 5 should take us up to at least the beginning of the Revolutionary War, I do believe. So that is where I will pick up next time. If you guys have any questions about anything, let me know. Shoot me an email, and I'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye.